Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Pluralism Initiative. Did you want to? Welcome to the Pluralism Initiative. I'm Liza Oliver, Director of the Pluralism Initiative and Associate Professor of Art History, and I'm very happy to welcome to campus this evening Michael Geruso, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Texas, Austin, and he's here to talk about his book, co-authored with fellow economist Dean Spears, entitled After the Spike: Population, Progress, and the Case for People, published with Simon & Schuster Press and forthcoming this summer. Professor Geruso has served as senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors under the Biden administration. He's widely published in leading peer-reviewed journals, and he's been featured in public forums such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, The Economist, NPR, and Vox. This evening, he will be in conversation with Phil Levine, Katharine, Coman, and Barton Hepburn, Professor of Economics here at Wellesley College, and they're going to discuss the rapid decline of the global human population projected to occur after its anticipated peak at 10 billion in the mid-2080s, and what this decline will mean for humanity. Professor Levine is an accomplished economist on themes as far-ranging as fertility, retirement, college pricing, and child poverty. And he's a non-resident fellow of the Brookings Institute and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, with essays and appearances in nearly all major U.S. newspapers and news channels. Before I hand the floor over to them, I want to make you aware of the advertisement in the back that you see. There is a QR code there that you can scan with your phones in order to get a free copy of Professor Geruso's book when it's out this summer. So if you're interested in that, please do scan that QR code and you'll have access to that. And for those of you who are joining on Zoom, you can get access to that QR code through the same means that you signed up for the Zoom live stream. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professors Michael Geruso and Phil Levine.
Thanks, Liza. I appreciate the introduction. I'm really happy to be here with Mike today. We've been interacting for a few years now on sort of work of common interest, and I'm really excited about this book that's coming out. You definitely should get your free copy because it's a really good book, and it's free. So I want to get started just by sort of going through some background information. So, tell us something about who you are, how you got to the point of writing this book, why are we here today?
Sure. So, Mike Geruso, I'm a professor at UT in the economics department, and for a long time my work has covered issues in health and healthcare and demography. So demography, we mean births and deaths, and in particular around the world, so global demography. How we came to, my co-author and I, Dean Spears, how we came to work on this topic and ultimately this book, I think was really just about just how compelling the basic facts were once we started to understand them. And sitting with the basic facts about declining birth rates around the world, about what that would mean for population sizes over time, what population size means for progress that we all should care about. Sitting with that, thinking about it, we sort of got hooked on this topic. And let me try to sort of share, just an outline of the facts that we find so compelling about this. So for most of human history, so humanity as a species, we've been around for more than 100,000 years. For most of that time, there weren't very many people on the planet. 10,000 years ago, there were maybe 5 million people all over the world. So that's like, you could fit those in Metro Atlanta today. Even 2,000 years ago, beginning of the Common Era, there were maybe 300 million people. We don't know exactly, but something in that order. So a little bit less than the current population of the United States. And for most of these 100,000-year or more history, we had very, very slow population growth. We had very slow growth and progress in basic material living standards. And then over just the last couple hundred of years, population started to spike. And that's a topic of a whole other book, or many other books, including a great book by my PhD advisor, Angus Deaton. So some of this, to the question of how do we get interested in this, I've been interested in demography and poverty and growth around the world for a long time, and part of that is from my exposure as a graduate student to my advisors, Ann Case and Angus Deaton, who studied the lives of the global poor. But we learned how to keep people alive. And as people survived childhood for the first time in history, 10,000 years ago, or even just a few hundred years ago, maybe you would have a 50-50 chance of reaching adulthood after being born. Maybe you'd have a third chance. We don't have great records, but something in that range. But once we learned to keep people alive, they grew up and they had more children of their own. So the global population spiked. And it didn't spike because birth rates went up. It spiked because we kept people alive. And so in the last couple hundred years, we reached a global population of 1 billion around 1800. Then we doubled in the next century. By 1925, 2 billion. And then since then, in the last 100 years, we've reached, we've quadrupled again. And so we're at 8 billion people now. And so those basic facts are super compelling to us. But what was even more interesting in some ways is the question of what happens next. Because what is projected to happen, and what everyone should reasonably expect to happen, is that within the lifetime of people alive now, the global population will peak, and then it'll start declining. And when it declines, it could decline just as fast as it grew. So we live in a very special time in human history. We live in this time where we've been part of a big growing world. We might expect that the world will continue to grow or continue to be big, but if you were to plot, and we do in the book, which is around here somewhere, but if you plot, what the global human population looks like over its long history, it's this spike up in the last couple hundred years, and then all the projections say that we should expect it to come down. It could come down just as quick. And so to sort of close out this idea, the question that we're asking in the book is first laying out the facts. What should we expect to happen and why? But then also, what should we want to happen? Should we be welcoming of this change? Is this something that's going to be good for humanity? Is this something that's going to be good for the things that we care about, climate and equity and progress for the lives of the global poor? Or is this something that might have negative consequences that we should try to we should be concerned about, or possibly even try to change the course of? So that's how we came to the book, and that's what the book is about. And and in the book, we kind of go chapter by chapter, taking on what are the reasons why we might want a smaller population, what are the reasons why might we want a larger population. Yeah.
Great. So I should share, by the way, that I went to graduate school at the same place just a lot earlier, so his advisors also were people that I studied with a lot earlier. The issue, though, is that studying population and fertility, I'll be blunt about it. How is that economics? What is it? How is that an economics question? And a lot of times when people talk about the economics of fertility, they're worried about is there going to be enough people around today to fund the Social Security system 25 or 50 years from now? Is that what's your goal in all of this? What are you hoping to accomplish? And in particular, if you can provide some insight as to what does an economist contribute to this discussion?
Yeah. So the second part of that first, what does an economist contribute to this discussion? There's questions about what has caused the decline in global birth rate. So, I didn't say, but I think to everyone it's pretty obvious. Why is the global population going to start declining? Well, at some level, the answer is obvious. It's birth rates. But what's the deeper answer there? Why are birth rates declining? And so, understanding the history of economic progress, understanding opportunity and opportunity cost, and thinking about, at some level, economics is a study of human behavior and incentives and responding to those incentives. And so there are very natural questions here for economists to answer. What is the system of social incentives, financial incentives, economic incentives that have caused people to choose differently over time? At some level, the amount of the number of children that I want or you want, it's not printed in our DNA. It's not seared in our soul. And even if it were, DNA isn't changing very fast over time. And so it has to be something about the environment that we live in, the incentives that we're subject to. So thinking about the causes of low birth rates around the world, economics has a huge role to play there, but also, I couch that more in microeconomics, right? Applied empirical microeconomics. I know a lot of the students in the room are economics students, but also thinking about the consequences of what comes next. That's an important question that the macroeconomics of growth is concerned about. Because, and just to sort of tease, where hopefully we'll get a chance to come back to, I don't think it's a coincidence, and the economists, the macroeconomists of growth who study this don't think it's a coincidence that in the last few hundred years, when we've had all of this population growth, we've also had all of this economic growth. And by economic growth, I don't mean like stock tickers have gone up. I mean people have shoes and jobs and beautiful climate-controlled classrooms to study in, and lights to turn on, and things to read. And so the question of how does growth and progress continue, because progress isn't evenly distributed and progress isn't everywhere, and we need a lot more progress in a lot of places in the world, and I would even say we need a lot more progress here. What does a declining population mean for the prospect of building an abundant future with the sort of progress that the world desperately needs? So both on the micro side and the macro side, it's a question for economists, or at least to have part of that conversation.
So one of the things which I find interesting about this whole line of inquiry is that, back in the day, when I was in college, there was a lot of concern about the population size as well. It's just that the concern about the population size was the other way. There's, a famous book came out in the 60s. I was not in college in the 60s. But not that long afterwards, it was still sort of in sort of the conventional wisdom that there's too many people on the planet. We're not going to be able to support this many people. There's going to be famine, and all sorts of bad things are going to happen because of it. And we need to find ways to reduce the size of the population. Now, you're telling us almost the opposite, that this is something we should be worried about because there's going to be not enough people, not too many people. What's up here?
Yeah, so I mentioned, just to give some context, I mentioned at the beginning that what the book does is go through the arguments for people, the case against people, and where it comes down is in favor of finding a way to stabilize the population rather than sort of depopulating indefinitely. So there, for a long time, the popular fear, and I think it still is a popular concern, it's morphed a little bit over time, but you're much more likely to find someone today who is concerned about overpopulation in some form or another than this future that we're heading towards of depopulation. So this book that Phil mentioned, which was published in 1968, I think, was The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich. It was, I think it was published by the Sierra Club, so there was a very close tie between the sort of anti-population movement and the environmental movement of the 1960s and 1970s. And the core thesis of the book was that we've reached the Earth's carrying capacity. There are 3.5 billion people on the planet in 1968. We cannot afford to have any more people born because those people will starve to death by the billions. And of course, that isn't what happened. What happened is that we've more than doubled the size of the world since then. There's 8 billion people alive today, or a little bit more. And in those decades, since the 1970s, every single year, not only have we grown more calories, because the book was very focused on famine and death that all these people would bring. Not only have we grown more calories overall, we've grown, that pace of that has been so fast, we've grown more calories per person, even as the population was growing on every continent on the planet. So what's interesting, the really short answer, I should probably get used to giving short answers. The really short answer to your question is Ehrlich and his cohort were just wrong. In 1968, and they were wrong in many ways. I think they were wrong about the facts and about human development. They were also very wrong about their response to this. They were talking about putting temporary sterilants in the water supplies to control population. Just really awful stuff. But they were also, in many ways, wrong about the facts. In the early 1960s, the Green Revolution was already starting to get underway. We were learning to grow more food on less acreage, to have, I think, Norman Borlaug working in Mexico, finding ways to put more grain on the end of the wheat stalk and grow the stalk smaller so that it wouldn't fall over and we could recover more of the food. And so we've just become more and more efficient. But that was already happening when he wrote this book, when he published this book. When you were in college, even when I was in college, in the late 90s, early 2000s, that was still a very popular idea. We could not, support all these people on the planet, right down to the same arguments about famine and environmental destruction. Even though by then we had decades of experience that showed us that that just wasn't true. So, and part of the reason why we're writing the book is to sort of correct the record. There's a lot of tropes that are just wrong about population, and we want to bring social science to that and bring the facts to that.
Great. So just recently, I think maybe the last few weeks or month or so, I was reading this article, I think it was in The Atlantic, I'm not positive, that talked about falling fertility in South Korea. And the anecdote that it gave that just sort of like really drove it home for me was that if you took, based on their birth rates, if you took 100 young people today and aged them out until they were the age of grandparents' age, so 2 generations forward, in 100 of them, those 100 people would have 12 grandchildren. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, I mean, to be clear, South Korea is the most extreme example today, but yes. It just to sort of draw that out, like, where does that number come from? Because I think understanding that number can really help you get a sense of what's going on here. Let's actually not do South Korea. Let's do China, which has a birth rate of 1 child per 2 adults, because that's just going to make the math easier for us all to do in our heads on the fly. So if you have 2 parents, they together have, or 2 adults in one generation, 1 child in the next. That means that in a generation of 100 people, that's 50 people in the next generation, and then 25 people in the next generation. So you go from 100 to 25, a 75% reduction in just 2 generations. And you do the same exercise with South Korea, except South Korea's birth rate is not 1 child per 2 adults, it's 0.7 children per 2 adults. But you do the same math, and you get to 12 grandkids for 100 people in the grandparents' generation. Yeah. Some of whom will not be grandparents, of course.
Right. This is all probabilistic. You sort of already started this answer, but if I can get you to elaborate a little bit more on it. And for people who think about fertility, there's this magic number of 2, or maybe a little bit more than 2, which is the total fertility rate, and that number gets tossed around routinely in settings where people really have no idea what that's telling us. Could you just sort of say a little bit about what is this number?
Yeah. So a birth rate of 2 roughly is the number that would cause population stabilization. So that doesn't mean 2 for everybody. That's a lot of zeros, a lot of 1s, a lot of 3s, a lot of 4s. In the U.S., the times when it's been closer to, it's also been a lot of 2s. As far as individual families, parents go. But 2 parents creating 2 children in the next generation is population stabilization over time. It's not exactly 2, like you sort of hinted at, because not every child will grow up to live through their adult years, their childbearing years, so it's a little bit greater than 2. It's also the birth rate is typically reported in demographic studies, or if you're reading a newspaper article, as births per woman. And so because it's births per woman, not births per 2 adults, it also has to be a little bit bigger than 2, because just biologically, if you have for every 100 women that are born, 100 females that are born, you have about 105 males that are born, assuming there's no sex selective abortion going on. So that's why the number is a little bit more than 2, but basically 2 is the replacement rate, and replacement here means just that the same generation size, cohort after cohort.
There's nothing magical that makes that happen.
No, there's nothing magical that there's no reason. Yeah, that's a really good point. 2 in some ways is a magic number in terms of demographic statistics and in terms of plugging a number into our equations of exponential growth or exponential decay of the population size. But 2 doesn't contain any magic in the sense of when birth rates get to 2, they stop there. And an average birth rate or total fertility rate of 2 really does contain a lot of heterogeneity within a society that produces it.
So in the United States today, we're at a little bit of 1.6-ish. So that's for every 2 adults, they're having 1.6 children. And it's, still falling below that. But even at 1.6, let's hold that constant. If I'm not mistaken correctly, that's not a picture's not on the slide, but the cover of the book, for those who've seen it, has the picture of this huge spike. And if I'm not mistaken, that's the 1.6 is the number that you use to generate this picture.
Yeah.
So, this picture is pretty dramatic, which is, I'm assuming, why it's on the cover of the book. You get this huge run-up, or, this huge decline coming in the next, couple centuries. Yeah, and over the next few centuries. So in this is what would happen if we continue down our current path in the United States today, essentially forever. But when I go out in the world and I walk down the street and I take a walk in my neighborhood, there's a school, there's parks, there's kids in the schools, the parks seem full. Like, I don't really notice that there's anything, it doesn't feel like the world's collapsing in that sense, because there's not any kids. What's up with that?
So I don't think that you walking around a society where total fertility rate was 2, so you're sort of on course for a stabilized future, or the fertility rate is 1.6, which is kind of the long-run assumptions that we made to generate this spike of long-run population decline. I don't think it feels very different. I don't think, I lived in Boston most recently before I lived in Austin, Texas. The total fertility rate in Texas is 1.8. The total fertility rate in Massachusetts is 1.4. It's the same as the difference between 1.6 and 2. And it does not feel very different. It doesn't feel different bringing the kids to the pool. It doesn't feel different dropping the kid off at school. It doesn't feel different at the grocery store. It can feel very similar. But that similarity, that feeling of familiarity is deceiving, because the difference between 2 and 1.6 is the difference between a stable population and indefinite decay in the exponential sense. So I think of it's a bit. I think of a climate analogy here as being helpful, at least for me getting my head around this. If in one world, if I lived in a home that was powered by wind and solar and nuclear energy, that was all net carbon zero, that would not feel very different to me from living in a home that was powered by fossil fuels, if they were burning those fossil fuels fairly far away. But those two things would lead to a profoundly different future, even though I wouldn't feel it in my daily life. And I think that there's something similar there with birth rates that would lead to long-term population decline versus birth rates that would set us up for a stable future.
And so we talked about, China and South Korea came up already, that are well below 1.6. What is the, in terms of the world fertility distribution, so to speak, look like? Is this just, in Asian countries it's really low, and in other countries it's not so? Like, what is it, is it just high-income countries? Like, what's the distribution of this statistic sort of around the world?
Yeah, so we mentioned some richer Southeast Asian countries. Korea is the lowest in the world at 0.7, China at 1. But it's not just East Asian countries or just the US or Europe. So Europe's at 1.5. Latin America as a whole is at 1.8. Canada is below 2. Mexico is lower than the United States, recently dipped below the United States. India, which was the center of Paul Ehrlich's fears about overpopulation in the 1960s, India is a place where birth rates are now below replacement. So they're already below 2. And when you, so my co-author on the book, Dean Spears, his work is largely focused in India. And even when you talk to very poor women in India, so the, people who, have very little material wealth, living very traditional lives, the sort of development has not come to them yet. Those are people that want 1 or 2 kids, right? So this is not just a phenomenon of the rich world or even of middle income countries or something special about East Asia. This is, you spin a globe and you close your eyes and you have a finger that lands somewhere where people live. Chances are those people are living in a below replacement place. So like the actual statistic is 2/3 of people alive live in a country with below replacement fertility. And I should just say the one place where that's not currently true is sub-Saharan Africa. But even there, birth rates are falling.
So, I mean, it just begs the question, why? What's going on? Tell us.
Okay, I'm going to disappoint you. Not only because I'm not going to give you an answer, but maybe I'm going to disappoint you as an economist. And I would love, maybe I'll ask you what you think about my answer in a minute, because I'm curious what you think. You've written a book on the economics of fertility, so you can beg off if you want to, but I may come back to you with this. My impression of the literature as a whole is that we really don't know the answer to this question. That does not mean that there aren't plenty of people who say that they know what the answer to this question is. It's just that if you were to ask 10 people who would confidently say what the answer to this question is, you would just get 10 different answers potentially. And so we've heard plenty of people say things like, I'm thinking about Americans in particular, this is just a symptom of capitalist or neoliberal or your free market economy in the U.S. They might use different words, but the idea being that how can you make a lifelong commitment to bring a new child into this world when there's so much economic precarity? You don't know that you're going to have a job next month. You don't know that your landlord isn't going to raise rent. But birth rates are low in places with much stronger job protections. They're low in the democratic socialist countries of Northern Europe, where there's job protections, there's much more redistribution, higher tax rates, a much stronger social safety net system, universal health care. Those are places where people are having even fewer children than in the United States. So that can't be the answer. Just to run through a couple others, there's people say this is something about young people not getting married or not forming long-term, dedicated relationships or cohabitating. But again, if you look around the world, you just find counterexamples to this kind of explanation. India, which I just mentioned, has below replacement fertility. India is a place where basically everybody gets married, and they get married young. They get married by 20. They have their 1 or 2 kids, mostly 2, in their early 20s, and then they opt for sterilization. So this is not a phenomenon of people aren't getting married anymore. And then you hear all sorts of. I think people tend to find the answer to this question in whatever the thing that they already cared about. So if what you cared about is receding traditional values in your society, then you blame the recession of traditional values. If you just look around the world, there's a lot of variety in the way that people live, in the value systems, in individualism versus, community orientation, and low birth rates are basically everywhere. So none of that explains it. And I'll give one more because I think I sort of hit on this with the first one, but like there's a simpler version that a lot of people give, and that's just like. It's money, stupid. Like the children are just not affordable. And we spend a chapter on this in the book, trying to take apart this idea because we don't think it's right. And I won't read a whole chapter to you, or I won't do the equivalent of that. But here's like three quick ideas to help you at least a teaser of why we think money is not the answer. First, if you just look in a cross-section, if you look around the world, it's not the places where people are richest where they're having the most babies, right? Birth rates and national income is not correlated, or at least not in that direction. The poorest region in the world is sub-Saharan Africa. I just mentioned that They have the highest birth rate, so it's not like high birth rates go with more income. But that's also true if you look, within a country. It's not like rich people are having tons of babies and poor people aren't having any babies because they can't afford them. So that's not really an answer. But if you think about affordability a different way, like, well, what does it cost to raise a kid? What does it cost to put a kid in daycare? What does it cost to put a kid through college? There too, just the facts don't line up, because when you look at places that have universal daycare, or you look at places that, free, universal, socially provided daycare, or heavily subsidized, or free, or heavily subsidized college tuition, those are not places where birth rates are higher than the United States or higher than 2. And here's like, to get back to our applied microeconometric roots, there are some cool papers that look at what happens when somebody wins the lottery. When people of childbearing age, and women in particular, when they win the lottery, do they form larger families than following women who play the lottery and lose or win smaller jackpots? And the answer is no. So money is not the answer, at least not in any sort of simple, straightforward way. But what do you think?
So this is your event and not mine. I will just simply say that your initial statement, or one of your initial statements, that anytime that you ask, someone, what do you think, and they can come up with an answer in 10 seconds, it's wrong. In this particular case, it's much more complicated than, housing costs are rising so people can't afford to have kids. That just doesn't work in terms of like what the data can support. But we'll do another event and I'll. So birth rates are falling pretty much everywhere. We don't 100% know why, but that doesn't prevent the outcomes. Why does this matter? Why do we care about any of this? So, we're economists. We like to think about costs and benefits in terms of everything. That's how we think about the world. What's the cost associated with this declining fertility rate?
Yeah, so I hinted at the sort of category of costs that I thought were pretty important at the beginning. And I think there could be a real cost for progress. Just to zoom way out for a second, why are we, everyone in this room, probably everyone watching, why are we so rich relative to humanity's past? Like, why are none of us, whatever our financial struggles are, no one here, I assume and hope, but I'd be willing to bet, is worried about whether they're going to have enough to eat next week or next month. There's that level of insecurity just doesn't exist anymore in our society, and it's becoming less and less common around the world. Why is that? It's not because, the Earth is offering up something more or different than it used to. The rocks below our feet, the Earth's crust, is the same as it was 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago. What's different is know-how. I'll talk to him about non-rival innovation as the key to this, but what's different now is that we know how to extract silicon and gold and copper from those rocks, and we know how to put that together in complex manufacturing processes to make computer chips. We know how to string those computer chips together to either put artificial intelligence in our pocket, or to create great statistical software so that we can analyze trends in birth rates. What separates us now from people who lived in our poor past is know-how. And that know-how came from people. When someone, or not really someone, but many someones over time develop a germ theory of disease, and from that germ theory of disease, we learn about how to wash hands, and it also becomes an input to making antibiotic pills and reducing infectious disease transmission. And from all of that, we keep people alive for longer. We avoid child deaths. We live healthier, longer lives. That knowledge, once it exists, persists forever. So if you treat your sick kid with an antibiotic pill to treat some nasty bacterial infection, that pill is gone. That one pill will never be consumed again. But the knowledge that went to that pill, the science behind it, the science that we built on in the future to create the next iteration of the antibiotic pill, is something that is preserved, is undiminished for every time we use it. And the way that population fits in to this fact about non-rival innovation, the fact that we get ideas that we get to use over and over and over again, basically for free, is that those ideas come from people, right? And so every person, every 1,000 people, every community of people is an opportunity to discover more of the ideas that make life better for the rest of us. So at some level, whereas like a Paul Ehrlich population doomer sees people around them and thinks like, these people are the reason I'm not getting what I want or what I need. I look around and I see these people are exactly the reason that I'm getting exactly what I want and what I need. There was not going to be a flight from Austin, Texas to Boston, Massachusetts today, so I could be here if there weren't an awful lot of people who wanted to do the same thing, right? So, I mean, sometimes, the oldest cliche in economics is like, well, are we dividing up a pie, or are we baking a pie? And like, I think we're baking a pie, and in particular, I think like the reason I get to have my rhubarb pie is because like there's a bunch of other people who also want the exact same thing. They're not eating my pie; they're the reason someone is baking.
Great, I like rhubarb pie. So what about, are there, we live in a world where we face significant environmental concerns. People generate pollutants that harm the planet, make it worse for all of us. And wouldn't it be better if there were just fewer people to do less environmental damage that would sort of improve our lives?
Yeah, so that is probably the most common reaction I get when I talk about these ideas with my students at UT Austin, both undergrads and grad students, and also just like when I talk about these ideas with just people in my life. I think that's wrong, and but I understand the logic. So just to be very clear, humans cause greenhouse gas emissions, human activity causes greenhouse gas emissions cause climate change. Usually people are mostly concerned with climate. It's not the only environmental thing. We have lots of problems, but climate is maybe the biggest one on people's minds. And so fewer humans would mean less human activity, would mean less greenhouse gases, less intense climate change. There's a couple problems with that. Let me start with one, and then maybe I'll get to the second. The second, in case I don't get to it, is timing. But let me just start with the idea that population is not a very powerful lever if the thing that you're concerned about is addressing climate change. So, and I find that it's helpful to communicate this in terms of an analogy. So if we like cast our minds back, we spent some time in 1960s so far in this talk. Let's go back to 1960s again. 1960s is a time where one of the environmental challenges that people were facing in the United States was that people were breathing in lead in the air. So lead is a terrible neurotoxin. It causes cognitive and behavioral development problems in children. It causes cardiac problems in adults. It kills people. It causes all sorts of problems, right? The reason we were breathing in lead is that we were burning leaded gasoline in our cars. Today, we don't breathe in lead. How was that changed? It was changed by the Clean Air Act of 1970, along with various amendments and other pieces of legislation that phased out the use of leaded gasoline in our cars and eventually banned it altogether for most uses in the United States. Okay. Now here's where I'm going to tie it back. Imagine in 1960 or 1970, if we said the way that we're going to deal with lead pollution in the air is we're going to hope for or try to bring about fewer people in the country. Or the way we're going to deal with lead pollution is we're going to try to have fewer people drive. That just would not have been a serious response to that climate or to that environmental and health emergency that we were facing, right? This bank shot through population just doesn't make a lot of sense. The thing that we need to do to deal with climate change, which is urgent, is we need to reform our land use, reform our industries, change our energy systems, change our energy transmission systems. But the fact that, in a few decades, we're going to start declining in population globally, that's not going to be a reason, that's not going to cause another wind turbine to go up or another array of solar panels to be put up. It's not going to cause more transmission lines to be laid across the country to move energy from where the sun is shining and the wind is blowing to where it's not. It's not going to invent green concrete or the other industrial changes that we need to make. So the population is like a bank shot, and not a very powerful bank shot. If what you want to do is deal with lead in the air, then you deal with lead in the air. If what you want to do is deal with carbon in the air, then you deal with carbon in the air. And maybe I'll just give a real quick hit on timing. The timing of this just also doesn't work out. So, we talked about at the beginning that population decline was going to start happening within the lifetime of people alive today, but not for a few more decades. So if what you think, which is what I think, is that climate change is urgent and we need to be doing things this decade and next decade, and if we're really messing up the decade after that and the decade after that, then you've described a series of decades in which the population is still going to be climbing, even though it's more and more slowly and just about to hit its peak. So even though at the level of generations, like the South Korea example, where 100 people with 12 children in the grandchildren's generation, even though this thing is coming fast at the level of generations, and then once it starts, it's going to be quite fast, the timing does not line up in a way that gives us any relief or reprieve from taking climate change head on.
So another potentially troubling aspect of this is that, okay, so let's assume that we move into a world where we kind of can agree that it would maybe be desirable to have more children. There's aspects of that which are potentially troubling as well, in the sense that, so first of all, anytime you move into a discussion of changing the number of children being born, people start raising questions about which children? And so in the case of when people talk about declining birth rates, they're worried about arguments about eugenics. And sort of the opposite in terms of encouraging fertility. Is that something that we should worry about? And then there's also this sort of other issue that, are we just moving in, are we moving into a Handmaid's Tale world in which, women's rights are destroyed in the pursuit of having more children? How do these other things work out?
Yeah, that is a big question. Yeah, so let me just say, because I think, it wouldn't necessarily be obvious just yet from this talk, but let me just be really clear what we say in the book on issues of reproductive health, access to abortion. What we care about in this book is humanity's future as a whole, everybody across the world. So on the topic of who's having babies, who's not having babies, that's not something that we get into in the book, because it's not something we care about. What we care about is global depopulation. It's the same reason we don't talk about immigration in the book. You got to look at the book preview. Immigration isn't something we talk about because when we're talking about global depopulation, there is no immigration to or from planet Earth, right? So when we're talking about this as a global problem, we are not focused at the country level, and we talk. This is not an America First book. This is a book that we talk about the world, and India is as big a character in the book as the United States, or maybe a little bit bigger, just because of where my co-author's expertise is in demography. But should we be worried about a Handmaid's Tale? I mean, I am very worried about a slide to authoritarianism, including in this country. I am concerned about liberal democracy surviving in its best form. I don't think that's a reason for people in the center-right, center-left, liberals, progressives, to not be caring about the future of the population, because I think if you care about progress, you should care about the future of the population. And I also think you don't want to leave this conversation if people who care about reproductive freedom are not part of this conversation, then the only people who are going to be part of this conversation are people who don't care about reproductive freedom. And so that's why this book is a call to broaden the conversation about birth rates, because I don't think that there's anything fundamentally incompatible between caring about bodily autonomy, caring about reproductive freedom, caring about access to the full range of reproductive health care options, contraception, Plan B, abortion, and also caring about what all these individual decisions add up to for the world as a whole into the long-run future.
And so, okay, so suppose we all, jump on board. We're like, okay, we recognize the problem. We think we should encourage people to have more children. Now, it turns out to be the case that in the United States we're late to this game, right? I mean, in most of the developed and high-income countries, birth rates have been falling for, 40, 50 years or something like that. And, we only started 15 or 20 years ago. Have other countries, has anyone done it right? and figured out what the magic solution is that sort of makes birth rates rise?
So I could give a very quick answer here, which is no. The answer is no. And I think, it is connected to this answer before of nobody really knows at any level of detail that could suggest a policy response. Nobody knows exactly why birth rates are falling. Like, there's lots of convergent things that are happening, and we can tell stories, and we do in the book, about just in general opportunities are expanding, and as opportunities expand, as your choice set expands, as there's more wonderful things that the world offers, children are competing with that greater set of choices. So here's one statistic that I think helps back up my claim that no country has figured this out. No policy, no culture has figured this out. For as long as we have good demographic data on birth rates, there have been 26 countries around the world where lifetime cohort fertility, so following the same people over their lifetime and seeing how many children they have, has that ever fallen below 1.9? And in 0 of those 26 countries have birth rates ever rebounded above replacement again. So that doesn't mean that it couldn't happen, but it does mean that it hasn't happened yet, and we don't have a track record of it happening. So whatever countries have done in terms of implementing, greater protections for parents on parental leave, making parental leave paid, offering free daycare, trying in all the ways that governments do, which is usually about money in one way or another, of subsidizing or giving larger child tax credits. No one has found a way to raise birth rates by very much. That's not to say nothing does anything. I think there's some evidence that maybe free daycare can nudge birth rates up a little bit. But most of these things don't do much, and many of them don't do anything that is perceptible in the data.
Okay, well, that's depressing. So you're telling us there's this huge problem. We need to address it. Countries have tried addressing it in the past, and nobody's been successful. Where does that leave us?
Yeah, so that sounds very bleak. I am more optimistic than that last bit sounded.
Okay.
One reason I'm optimistic is there's just a lot we haven't tried. I mean, I don't think that we've really, as a society here or anywhere, really decided. I think you started the question with the conceit of, let's say we agree. Let's say we agree that this is something we'd like to do something about. And I don't think we've ever been in that place. I don't think we've ever en masse had the view that, yes, people are good. They're good for one another. They're good for themselves. And they're not like a scourge on the earth. And so we should think hard about stabilizing birth rates. I don't think we've ever been there. Another reason I'm optimistic, besides the fact that we haven't really tried, is that it's not like some alien landscape. It would be a world in which adults chose to have 2 children on average. Like, I grew up in the 1990s. In the 1990s, the birth rate in the U.S. was pretty close to 2. That was not like, because I lived through it, I know that it was not a very people here who weren't alive then would not find it unfamiliar territory. It was not, so it's just like not hard to imagine that that could happen. That there's a big difference between that would feel not very different and like what are the steps to get there. But the fact that it would feel not very different, and I've experienced it, just doesn't feel very different culturally, gives me some hope. But also, we have time, right? So there are many urgent problems in the world, right? So I've mentioned one that I'm very concerned about on the years level rather than decades level, which is a slide towards authoritarianism in liberal democracies. There are many other urgent challenges, the global poverty, climate. And so, we're asking people to consider in this book is to add this to the list of important, but not the most important, but important problems to be thinking about and dedicating attention and resources and careers to. And the reason, maybe the last thing I'll say about why I think there's room to be optimistic is, this is a change that is maybe, we're going to peak maybe 5 or 6 decades from now, maybe a little bit sooner. 5 or 6 decades prior to now was a time when scientists were just sounding the alarm on climate change for the first time. It was a time when we were first at just the most basic scientific level becoming aware that human activity was causing these greenhouse gases. These greenhouse gases were going to, over time, cause the planet to warm. That was going to generate climate change. We didn't have complicated computer models of what that would look like or how it would, change wind patterns or ocean current patterns over time. We didn't have computers that could do that back then. We didn't have careers dedicated to it. We didn't have, if you had said in 1960, when we knew that climate change at the basic level of the physics was going to be a problem and what was causing it, if you said, what we should do is eliminate the internal combustion engine, that would have been a crazy thing to say. It's not a crazy thing to say anymore because our awareness of the issue, our politics that have been built around it, our technologies that have been inspired by those politics and that social awareness has got us to a point where we really could eliminate the internal combustion engine. That's within our grasp. It's not crazy anymore. It's not done, but we could do it. And so I think that's where this issue is right now. We're 6 decades away from the peak. We have time. We have time for investment. We have time for learning. And there's just so much that there is still to learn and so much that there is still left to try.
So we actually had a discussion about this before this event started, but I'm going to bring it up here anyway. I do research on this in this area as well, and I think in both of our cases, when we started working on topics like this, half a dozen or more years ago, this was a backwater topic and question that nobody really paid attention to, and we can sort of work in our offices and come up with results and hypotheses and interpretations and whatever, and then go about our business. And that seems to be changing now, and that this topic of fertility and having more babies is now becoming sort of a front page newspaper stories. This was actually, took this out of yesterday's New York Times, and the headline was, "They want more babies, now they have friends in the White House." And then it goes on to say, as fertility rates have declined, a pronatalist cluster on the right wing has been making the argument that public policy should encourage more childbearing. With President Trump's return to office, this group appears to have gotten closer to the center of power than ever before. So, as a researcher and a scholar, who presumably has political beliefs, but not what drives the work that you do, how do you navigate the waters to sort of get the word out in as scientific a way as you can, and not have it usurped by people who have their own agendas? This is, it's a different world, and what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I mean, I'm gonna find out maybe the hard way as the book comes out. What I can say is what's in the book, is social science, and yeah, I think it is a challenge because a few years ago, if we had written this book and it came out a few years ago or a decade ago, I think people. It's a mixed bag. I think fewer people would have read the book. But I think the people who would have read it wouldn't need to know, like, hey, wait a minute, what's your political orientation? Right? That wouldn't be the first question on their mind. I think it's unfortunate that that's where we are now, but I do think it's where we are now. Our hope is that one of the things that the book does is turn down the temperature on the politics, because this really is this really is a sort of straight down the middle social science. Like, we're not juking the stats when we like plot birth rates in Stata, or show the relationship between gender pay gaps and birth rates across OECD countries, or age at first birth in India over time, or children's heights in India over time as progress has unfolded and nutrition has increased. Like, it's social science in here, and hopefully us writing this book can inject some facts back into this and try to pull it back from the brink of just sort of being lost in a culture war issue. So I read a book by these writers. One of them is a feminist philosopher, Anastasia Berg and Rachel Weissman. And the book is What Are Children For? It's a great book, and if you're interested in this topic, you should read it. They're a very different sort of research orientation than us. They're writers, and Anastasia is a philosopher. But they had a beautiful line in an op-ed, which was, and I'm gonna paraphrase. I'm not gonna be exactly right, but the question of children is too important to be a casualty of the culture war. And I think that encapsulates my feelings better than I could come up with on my own. This is an important topic. I don't want it to be a casualty of the culture war. I don't want it to be a political left-right football. And I hope that our book is going to help in that direction. But of course, I don't know what's going to happen.
Great. So, on that note, Liza, do you want to do question and answer? Do you want to? I think we're ready for question and answer. So, do you want to? Oh, okay. Questions?
Thank you so much for coming here to talk. I guess, like, when you were mentioning depopulation, like, being like a general trend in the globe, I was curious about like differing rates of that depopulation. Like, certain countries are certainly like decreasing in population faster, and even individual groups are like increasing or decreasing population faster. What kind of like consequences or maybe even causes of that differing rate do you like have opinions on?
I think the most striking fact is just the convergence. So, every state in the United States has a birth rate below 2 now. Whites, blacks, Hispanics, all birth rates below 2 in the United States. Every Canadian province. I think that the interesting fact is the convergence. I think I mentioned this, Latin America, birth rate of 1.8. Massachusetts has the same birth rate as Russia. This is if Dean, my co-author here, who spends a good part of his year each year in India, he would tell you that, among the caste hierarchy in India, it used to be a sort of stylized fact. Everyone understood that Muslims had much higher birth rates. The Muslim minority in India had much higher birth rates than the Hindu majority. That the lower scheduled castes, the Dalits, had higher birth rates than a higher caste. But birth rates for all of these groups in India is falling, just as it's falling for all of our different socioeconomic ways that we divide up our country here. And so, I think the interesting fact is convergence. But why is Massachusetts at a birth rate of 1.4 and Texas, where I'm coming from, at 1.8? I don't have the answer to that question. I'm not sure. I'm sure anybody does.
Excuse me. Yes, thank you so much for coming. This was a fascinating topic. I'm curious, so you talked a little bit about the concept of sort of women's rights involved in the conversation. And we were also exploring the idea that it's really hard to capture sort of what the reasons are for a declining birth rate because, you know, there's a sort of unified declining birth rate in a lot of places that are very different. But I'm curious, in all of these places in which we're looking, have there been this sort of increase of women's rights in terms of like the agency over like, I'll be blunt, like the decision of whether or not they want to have children, right? And I'm curious if the sort of increase globally for women to decide whether or not they want children could be a sort of leading factor in why birth rates are declining, because sort of women are, you know, participating more in the workforce, and, you know, busier people in the workforce might not have time for babies. And so I'm curious sort of what, you know, the increase in sort of women's participation in the economy, how you might see that impacting women being less sort of willing to have children.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So, and I'm going to give a complicated answer because I think it's complicated. Certainly, the advance in the last 50 years, last century, last 25 years, in terms of women's labor force participation and just greater, fuller participation in society overall around the world is an important phenomenon that has to contribute to lower birth rates. Exactly how much, I don't know. But something that I find fascinating is it's not the case that if you just sort of look, you know, where are women most participating in the labor force, or where are women most fully participating in like the full cultural life of a society, versus, you know, being forced by cultural standards to remain in the home. That doesn't actually align very well with the differences in birth rates that there are. So, you know, most places on the planet are below 2, but, you know, within that below 2, some places have birth rates of 1, some places have birth rates of 1.8, and it doesn't align very well. And so one of the things that we do in the book is, this is obviously not the only measure that you would care about, but we look at the gender pay gap between men and women in the workforce. So how much less does a woman get paid than a man earning the median for women and median for men across these countries? And there's just a lot of variation in that, from almost perfect parity, but not quite, to like a 30% gap. And if you, I know there's a lot of economics students in the room, so I can say this. So if you just plot that variable along the horizontal axis and along the vertical axis, plot birth rates in those countries, what you get is just sort of like a scatter that doesn't point in any particular direction. So it's not like within the advanced economies that women's like full incorporation into the workforce predicts birth rates. It doesn't. And here's a fact that I think like really boggled my mind when I sat with it at first. You know, I mentioned birth rates in India are quite low. India is a place where women, by and large, do not work in anything that we would recognize as like out-of-the-home jobs. Never mind careers, but just women don't work outside of the home in the same way we'd expect from other middle-income or high-income countries. So I do think that's an important phenomenon. And that there's more opportunities for women. I think it's also an important phenomenon. There's more opportunities for men. I think it's an important phenomenon that the world has improved in so many ways, including in the ability of women to choose careers, to just be participants in the labor force. But that variation doesn't predict birth rates as well as, at least I thought before I looked at the data.
So I'm going to ask 2 questions because the first one might be unanswerable, so I apologize in advance. So you talked about how, 50 plus years later, we look back on Ehrlich's book and say, he's wrong, he was wrong. And you also said, well, with a little bit of hindsight, you can see why he was wrong, because he was missing these particular trends. 50 years from now, somebody says, these 2 guys, right, Geruso and Spears, they predicted this doom, and they were wrong. If you had to sort of think about, like, what could you be missing? that would make you wrong, what would that be? And if that's unanswerable, I'll come to the next question.
Yeah, no, I'll take a stab at that. That's a fun one. Well, I don't think that it's going to be in the category of I don't think it's going to be in the category of a declining population is going to save the environment. I think there's lots of reasons that we can all see that that's just not going to work because the timing doesn't work out. And I don't think it's going to be in the sort of the ideas that Paul Romer won the Nobel Prize for, that Chad Jones has written about, that this idea of non-rival innovation, that more people create a benefit to the people around them. In addition to whatever costs they cause, they create a benefit to the people around them. I think it's possible that population decline comes a little bit faster than we talk about in the book. So in the book, for the next until 2100, we use the UN's projections of population size. And then after that, because the UN doesn't project any further out than that, we add our own projections using the same cohort component methods. It could come faster than that. I think the UN has always been a little bit conservative in population decline and forecasting it. But I know but your question is not those things. It's could we have a rebound? And yes, we absolutely could. And I didn't do a good job of conveying this uncertainty in this talk. But in the book, we say, look, we're not saying that any particular future is guaranteed. But even if we think that it's a coin flip about heading towards depopulation, that should be a risk that we take seriously. We plan for various risks that may or may not come to pass. And even if this were, if it was a 20% chance, I think that's something that would be worth taking seriously. I don't know how quickly cultures could change and sort of the economic environment could change in a way that would make it desirable to choose children again in a way that most advanced economies haven't for decades now. But certainly that's possible. We could build a world in which, and I hope we do, and that's one of the things that we're trying to get in the book, is we could build a world where people feel like they can fit more into their life, more career, but also more family, and more of enjoying everything else that the world has to offer us. But we'd have to choose that.
Hi. I'm wondering, you talked about how technology allowed us to have more population. Do you think technology would allow us to have fewer population? Like, in terms of AI and automation, maybe so many things can be automated or made by not people, then maybe we don't need so many people to do the things we're doing right now. And there is a very popular theory in China that China needs to restructure its economy to allow for this depopulation and maintain our economy. Do you think these theories have some evidence behind them?
Yeah, so great question, and maybe that's another way in which we'll find out that we were wrong in some way. The idea that we're talking about needing people to make progress, and what your question raises is maybe we don't need people to make progress. Maybe AI will make the progress for us. It'll do the thinking and innovating and building that up until now in human history we've needed humans to do. I can't rule that out as an impossibility. I think there's a lot of things we don't know about what the next decade is going to bring in terms of AI and how it changes the relationship between people and innovation and work for that matter. I am skeptical that AI is going to replace all the innovating and learning that people do. I think maybe that's enough to say. And I think even if there's just a strong chance that AI is not going to step in and do all of the learning and innovating and researching and creating that people do, then this is something that we should take seriously. But that could be a way in which the book is wrong.
Thank you. Once, as soon as Phil brought up The Handmaid's Tale, I immediately had a dark cloud of dread come over my head for the rest of the talk. And I'm thinking about all of the ways in which it's very clear to me how this issue can be politicized by the right in terms of traditional family values and women versus women's reproductive rights, in terms of their fears of immigration, in terms of their fears of a declining white population. It is less clear to me how this issue might be politicized by the left. Are there ways that you see that happening?
The way that, just to be totally frank, the way that I have seen the issue politicized by my team is that I'm very concerned about is deciding that we face a dichotomy. Either you can believe that reproductive rights matter, the logic goes, or you can think that population size matters, but you're not allowed to think both things at the same time. And I think that's wrong. I think it's just empirically wrong, right? So pregnancy is a free choice in South Korea. Pregnancy is a free choice in France. Birth rates in France are twice what they are in South Korea. And so, yes to everyone choosing the families they want, choosing whether to have children, whether not to have children, when to have children, with everything on the table. Not only contraception and abortion, but also IVF, and ways to help people get the families they want. But saying that sort of choice is paramount does not nail everything down, because what people choose depends on the world they see around them, right? What people choose depends on the context in which they're making those decisions. And so there's just an awful lot of room to create a society in which people choose things that are better for their neighbors and for their community and for the world. Like in DC during my year working in the Biden administration, I took the bus to work, right? I didn't take the bus to work merely because it was better for the planet and better for traffic and better for, reducing traffic fatalities because it's not distracted drivers. I chose to take the bus rather than drive or take an Uber or do something else because it was convenient. The choice that was socially good, that was good for other people, was also the choice that was good for me personally. And I don't think that we should expect people to choose something that isn't what's good for them. If someone decides now that they don't want a family, they don't want a large family, they don't want children, they're probably not making a mistake for themselves, or at least I'm not going to say that they're making a mistake. But we might all be making a mistake if together we're not creating a system in which it's easier to choose more out of a life, to tell a life story, to choose a life story for yourself where you can combine all these things. And just to bring it back to your question, I'm concerned that in the politicization of this issue, where we're setting up this false dichotomy where we're ignoring the possibility of changing our society, changing our economy, changing the way that the context in which people are making these free choices.
Hi, I'm just wondering, I feel like when depopulation and population growth and decline is brought up, it sometimes gets reverted back to like the middle school biology example of the fly colonies. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, where it's like they keep going up, and then they level off and drop down a little bit. And I guess some arguments I've heard is, what's happening is just natural. It's biology, populations level off or drop. And I was wondering like if that was something you'd heard, what your thoughts on it were.
Yeah, we hear people say that, and I think that's that idea that where fruit flies or where bacteria in a petri dish, that where we're going to sort of expand, eat everything that there is to eat, and then once there's nothing left to eat, the population is going to shrink back down, really is not a good model for thinking about human behavior. If that was the way that we should think about human behavior, then you certainly wouldn't need to employ this person in your economics department to think, because humans respond to incentives. We make choices rather than merely sort of in a mechanical way responding to the environment. And so the flies in your example, they never chose, they never had the ability to choose contraception or oral pills and vasectomies. They never had the ability to choose IVF. We are a unique species in that way. So I think these like other models of bacteria in a dish or fruit flies in a colony just aren't the right model to think about. This is about what people choose. And so we should be thinking of it, we're going to get it wrong unless we're thinking of it in terms of choice.
Thank you so much for coming to speak. I kind of had a question about the fact that this topic is one that can be driven by fear, and I think like you kind of referenced in the 1960s book that there was probably some fear-mongering going on. How do you approach doing research in a topic that is potentially driven by fear, both for overpopulation and depopulation? And yeah, like kind of towing the line between you do have real concern for what the future holds, but not fear-mongering, kind of.
Yeah, I think we, at the end of the day, Dean Spears and I, my co-author, we're social scientists, we're economists. We're not politicians, and we're not sort of the sort of people that have whatever it takes to start a social movement. That's not us. We're social scientists. And so the book reads that way. And I will say we were concerned about this. We were concerned about making sure that you would really have to be reading the book in a maligned way to try to pick out bits of it and find in it us doing fear-mongering about our concern about depopulation over the long run. So I don't know. I think time will tell whether we were successful in that, in trying to turn down the temperature on that. But I can tell you that we very much tried to be serious and careful, and even though in many places it would have been easy to say something that was more provocative. And let me tell you, when you're publishing a book for a general audience, your publisher wants you to say something more provocative than you want to say as a social scientist, and we resisted that at every turn. That's what I can say.
Thank you again for coming. I wanted to ask a question because you mentioned earlier how we don't really have a very successful policy towards raising birth rates, or like raising birth rates by much. Among all the policies that you've like researched, is there any that you see that are very compelling or have like places to grow in terms of raising birth rates?
My understanding of the evidence is that what seems to have done the most to either slow the decline or reverse the decline, and by the most I mean something like 0.1 TFR points, like 0.1 children, is widely available, heavily subsidized, or universal daycare. For what little it's worth, my experience as a parent sort of aligns with that. Like that is a very difficult. It's a very difficult thing. Not just the money. I mean, obviously the money matters, but like just the availability of the service matters a lot in my experience. But what the research seems to say is that's the thing. But some of the things that don't work are pretty surprising. I talked about some of the things. One thing I didn't mention is IVF. I hope everybody who wants IVF gets IVF and gets it at a reasonable cost and doesn't break the bank. But it's really not clear that IVF, assisted reproductive technology, typically used at older ages, makes any difference at all on birth rates. Like it makes a difference in the lives of the people that use it, but it's not big enough to show up in the aggregate statistics. And I think part of that is, and this comes from research by economists Naomi Gershoni and Corinne Lowe. They have a nice paper for the economic students. I think it's in AEJ Applied. where they look at what happened when Israel made IVF free. And just to give a very quick summary of that, what they find is that women use IVF, but they use it in order to delay marriage, to delay childbearing, to spend more time in education, which is great. So great that they got more out of life than what they wanted. It did not give the policymakers what they wanted, which was higher birth rates. Right? So if you delay, knowing that you have the option of IVF later, then so since we're in the Q&A, we'll just go very economics-y here. What you do in that policy is you're expanding someone's budget set, broadly defined. And how they spend that budget set is up to them. And so you've given them more time, and they use that time to do something other than having more children.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm curious, I know you mentioned at one point that you, in your book, argue for a stable population being kind of optimal. I'm curious because obviously there are very different social and economic implications of having a population of 10 billion versus 6 billion and anything in between. Do you see there being sort of an optimum level, like in a world where we do find policies that can change birth rates and affect it? Is there an optimum time to implement those, or are you not there yet?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think you at the end you said the thing that, which is what I think is, we're not there yet. Meaning, like, we as a community of scientists, like, at some point, this is certainly a conversation for future generations and future researchers. It would be great and important to know whether a global population of 9.5 or 10 billion, where we might peak, is better, all things considered and everybody considered, than a global population of 4 billion or 2 billion. We see our job in this book as making, maybe you all are convinced, but I think probably not, and probably most people won't be convinced right away that stabilization at any level would be a good idea. And so what we're hoping for, making the case for in the book, is stabilization at some level rather than depopulation generation after generation. And again, all that would need to happen for depopulation generation after generation is for people to look around, and many people decide that they want 2 kids, and some they decide they want 1, and some 0, and some 3. And then depopulation is off to the races indefinitely. I doubt that, in a century from now, or even 50 years from now, that it'll be a matter of indifference to the climate scientists, the economists, whoever thinks they have some input into this question of what would be the right population size given various goals and trade-offs. But we're not there yet. But we would consider the book to be a huge success if we could just, if a large number of people thought, I guess people may be good for each other, and we may not want to have global depopulation continue indefinitely. Yeah. But it's the right question for the next generation of research to ask.
Hi, thanks again for coming. Really enjoyed the talk. So one thing that I've heard a lot from recent publications in The Economist is that there's a very obvious policy response in the rich world, which is to increase immigration. And I know your book took a global perspective and wasn't necessarily focused on the right solution for the rich world. But I'm curious, the political consensus right now in the rich world is definitely not pro-immigration. But if there were to be some reversal on that and an acknowledgement that increasing population was a good thing, could an acceleration of immigration from the poor or middle-income countries of the world into the rich world accelerate depopulation in those countries? And I guess secondarily to that, how does that shape the development outcomes of those countries if that were to occur?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think to the first part of the question, would immigration from the developing world or middle-income countries to the rich world, to Europe, to the United States, to Canada, how would that impact sort of the course of global depopulation, I think there's a nugget there of interest, which is that immigrants assimilate to the cultures that they're coming into, and so you see this in the United States with Latin American immigrants from Mexico, that they tend to, even when it comes down to birth rates, within a generation, the birth rates are very similar. So I guess I would say the direction of that effect sounds right. I don't know, and I can't do the back of the envelope calculation in my head right here, right now, to think, is the magnitude of that, given the number of immigrants and the fraction of the population that the sending countries are sending, is that ever going to show up on in terms of the long-term global depopulation trend that we're headed towards? I have to imagine that's going to be sort of within the noise, and by the noise, I mean, we don't know if 10 years from now the U.S. birth rate is going to be 1.65 or 1.4. Those things seem, in some sense, possibly equally plausible. But that would, I think, have a bigger effect than the conversion of immigrants from lower-income countries to the birth rates of the United States. Especially because, like I said at the beginning, birth rates just are not very different. I think we all have the sense that poor countries have higher birth rates. If Mexico, as of the latest statistics, which are 2023, because it takes a long time to compile statistics, but as of 2023, if Mexico was sending people to the United States, and then they adopted the fertility patterns of the United States, their birth rate would go up. Right? Okay, I think this is the last question. You've got it.
I don't want to disappoint. I guess I'm wondering if there's a specific margin that we should be thinking about in terms of solving this problem. Like, is the key to get people to go from not wanting to be parents to being parents? Or should we be thinking about trying to get people from going to want to have one kid to maybe 2 or 3? That's
super interesting. I like there's a lot there in terms of the efficacy of any policy to do anything on any margin or any change. But I am interested in this question, just like if you were to do a decomposition, where is the change coming from? Yes. Oh, you're writing a paper right now? Dean and I are also looking into this right now. Maybe we should. Okay, so we'll be referees on each other's paper, and we'll try to make sure our paper gets in and your paper gets rejected. Well, I mean, I'll be interested to hear what you say, but at least, we looked at this in different states in India, and at least some states in India, there certainly is, and this is going to be different across the world, but like in the U.S., there is an increase in childlessness. But even in India, if you're looking at the decrease, the pattern's a little bit different. And even if you sort of just do the average, throwing out the zeros, so ignore the folks that aren't having any children and ask, are people who are having children, are they also having fewer? The answer there is yes. And even looking only at people who have children, you can still get below replacement fertility in some states in India. The question of who should policy target, boy, we are so far from being able to answer that question. But in terms of where is the decline coming from, it's really coming from both margins.
Feels like I'm not giving up my seat.
I don't mind that. We'll talk about it at dinner.
So thank you everyone very much for coming. If you haven't already, please do scan the QR code behind you to get a copy of, or in front of you to get a copy of Professor Geruso's book. And please join me in thanking both Professor Geruso and Phil Levine.
Thank you all.